The security checkpoint at Riverside Memorial Hospital buzzed with its usual Tuesday afternoon chaos, visitors juggling flower arrangements, doctors rushing between wings, and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights casting everything in that peculiar institutional glow. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in line behind a young father bouncing a fussing infant, her worn leather medical bag clutched in one hand, the other buried deep in the pocket of her navy wool coat. She wore black leather gloves despite the April warmth seeping through the hospital's glass doors. Fingers flexed unconsciously around something small and metallic hidden in her palm. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Next, called the security guard, a middle-aged man whose nameplate read Martinez, and whose eyes held the particular weariness of someone who'd seen too many emergencies blur together. Elena stepped forward, placing her bag on the conveyor belt with practiced precision. The metal detector's arch loomed before her like a doorway to another world, one where her past couldn't follow. But today, something was different. Today, the machine screamed. The piercing shriek cut through the lobby's ambient noise like a scalpel through flesh. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The father with the baby turned, his child's cries suddenly seeming quiet by comparison. Elena stood frozen in the detector's frame, her face a mask of careful composure that had taken years to perfect. She knew what they'd found, the small titanium fragments still embedded in her left index finger, souvenirs from a basement in Damascus 3 years ago that no surgeon had been able to fully extract. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," Martinez said, his voice professional but tinged with curiosity. Elena complied, her movements fluid despite the thunder of her heartbeat. "Do you have any metal implants, jewelry, or medical devices?" "Some. Surgical pins," she replied, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. "Old injury." Martinez nodded, pulling out his handheld metal detector wand. "I'll need to do a secondary screening. Could you please remove your coat and step over here?" Elena's breath caught for just a moment, imperceptible to most, but Dr. Sarah Chun, the pediatric surgeon waiting in line behind her, noticed the subtle shift in posture, the way Elena's shoulders tensed like a cat preparing to bolt. Sarah had seen enough trauma responses in her work to recognize the signs, though she couldn't have imagined their true source. "Of course," Elena said, shrugging off her coat to reveal a simple gray sweater beneath. The wand passed over her torso, without incident, then down her arms. When it reached her left hand, it sang again, a metallic keen that seemed to echo off the hospital's walls. "I'm going to need you to remove your gloves, please," Martinez said, his tone apologetic but firm. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Elena's world narrowed to this moment, this choice, this revelation she'd spent 3 years avoiding. Around her, the hospital continued its rhythm, the squeaking of gurney wheels, the distant chime of elevators, the soft conversations of families navigating their own crises. But for Elena, time had stopped. She looked at Martinez, then at the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Sarah Chun stepped closer, her medical instincts sensing something deeper than a routine security check. There was Mrs. Patterson from the volunteer desk, her weekly flower arrangement forgotten in her hands. Dr. James Morrison from orthopedics, pausing on his way to surgery, his scrubs still bearing the evidence of his last procedure. And in the back, barely visible but somehow the most important presence of all, stood Captain Michael Torres, the hospital security chief, a man whose own military bearing might have recognized what Elena carried in her careful composure. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the first glove. The leather was soft, worn smooth by 3 years of constant wear, 3 years of hiding what lay beneath. She peeled it back slowly, revealing fingers that moved with surprising grace. Despite their history, the scars weren't immediately visible. They were subtle, precise. The kind of damage that spoke of calculated cruelty rather than accidental injury. But it was when she removed the second glove that the silence truly fell. The fingertips of her left hand told a story that words could never capture. They were a map of survival, each mark a coordinate in a journey through hell and back. The pinky finger bore a small, perfectly round scar where a heated nail had been pressed into the flesh. The ring finger showed the telltale signs of where the nail had been partially torn away, not in an accident, but with deliberate, methodical precision. The middle finger carried the deepest marks, thin lines that crisscrossed like the streets of an ancient city, evidence of cuts made to cause maximum pain while ensuring the victim remained conscious. But it was the index finger that made Martinez step back, his face going pale. The titanium fragments weren't from any medical procedure. They were embedded in a pattern, 7 small pieces arranged in a way that could only have been intentional. Someone had inserted them one by one, using Elena's finger as a canvas for their own twisted artistry. Sarah Chun's medical training kicked in, her eyes automatically cataloging the wounds, dating them, understanding their implications. These weren't the scars of an accident or even a single violent encounter. They were the result of systematic, prolonged torture, the kind that broke minds as surely as it broke bodies. "Jesus," whispered Dr. Morrison, the word escaping before he could stop it. Elena stood perfectly still, her scarred hands now visible. To everyone, her secrets laid bare under the hospital's harsh fluorescent lights. She didn't try to hide them, didn't pull her hands away or make excuses. Instead, she looked directly at Martinez, then at each person in turn, her dark eyes holding depths of experience that seemed impossible for someone who appeared to be in her early 30s. "The fragments," she said quietly, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of an accent that might have been Spanish, or Arabic, or something else entirely. "They're not magnetic. They shouldn't have triggered your detector." Martinez fumbled with his equipment, checking settings, running the wand over Elena's hands again. The device remained silent now, as if the metal had somehow changed its properties, or as if the revelation had satisfied whatever hunger drove its electronic screaming. "Captain." Torres stepped forward from the back of the group, his military bearing evident in every measured step. His eyes met Elena's, and something passed between them, a recognition that transcended words. He'd seen similar scars before, in classified briefings and debriefing rooms that officially didn't exist. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, and the use of her title wasn't a question, but a statement of respect. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office." Elena nodded, pulling her gloves back on with movements that were both careful and defiant. She was covering the scars again, but not out of shame, out of protection for those around her who weren't ready to carry the weight of what they'd witnessed. As the group began to disperse, Sarah Chun lingered. She dedicated her career to healing children, to mending what had been broken, to offering hope where none had existed before. Looking at Elena's carefully controlled expression, she saw something that called to every instinct she possessed. "Dr. Vasquez," she said softly. "I'm Dr. Chun, pediatrics, if you ever need. If there's anything I can do." Elena paused in the act of putting her coat back on, studying Sarah's face with eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Thank you," she said simply. "But some things heal better in the darkness." She walked away then, following Captain Torres toward the administrative wing, leaving behind a lobby full of people who would never quite forget what they'd witnessed. The metal detector had returned to its normal operation, buzzing occasionally as visitors passed through, but never again with that particular scream that had torn through the afternoon quiet. Mrs. Patterson stood clutching her flowers, there, bright yellows and reds suddenly seeming garish against the sterile hospital backdrop. She'd been volunteering at Riverside Memorial for 12 years, had seen accident victims and grieving families, had witnessed the full spectrum of human suffering that flowed through these doors daily. But she'd never seen anything like the Careful geography of pain written across Dr. Vasquez's fingertips. Dr. Morrison checked his watch, realizing he was now late for surgery, but found himself unable to move. He was an orthopedic surgeon, intimately familiar with the human body's capacity to endure and heal from trauma. But those scars spoke of something beyond his experience, beyond the scope of accidents and sports injuries that filled his days. They spoke of a world where healing was secondary to survival, where pain was a tool rather than a symptom. In his office overlooking the hospital's courtyard, Captain Torres poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine that had seen better days. Elena sat across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, gloves once again in place. The afternoon sun slanted through his window, casting long shadows across the floor, and highlighting the small American flag on his desk, a flag that seemed somehow insufficient in the face of what they weren't discussing. "How long?" Torres asked, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose own body carried invisible wounds. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days, Elena replied without hesitation. "Since I've been here, I mean." "Since the ... extraction." Torres nodded, understanding the euphemism. In his previous life, before hospital security and quiet afternoons reviewing incident reports, he'd been part of operations that sometimes required extractions. He'd never been on the wrong side of one, but he'd seen enough to recognize the aftermath when it walked through his doors wearing scrubs and speaking perfect English with just the faintest trace of something else. "The scars," he said carefully, "they're not random." Elena's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. "No, they're not. Your real name?" She was quiet for so long that Torres began to think she wouldn't answer. Outside his window, a helicopter landed on the hospital's roof, bringing someone else's emergency into their carefully controlled world. The whir of its rotors filled the silence until the engines wound down and quiet returned. "Elena Vasquez is real enough," she said finally. "It's the name on my medical license, my apartment lease, my library card. It's who I am now. And before?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Before, I was Dr. Amira Qasim. I was a trauma surgeon at Damascus General Hospital. I treated civilians caught in airstrikes, children who'd lost limbs to improvised explosives, families torn apart by conflicts they never chose to be part of." She looked up at Torres, her eyes holding steady despite the weight of her words. "I also treated rebel fighters, opposition leaders, people the government wanted to disappear." Torres leaned back in his chair, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "They took you. They took me." Elena's voice remained steady, but Torres saw her swallow hard before continuing. "For 6 months, I was a guest of the Syrian security services. They were very interested in the names of my patients, the locations of field hospitals, the identities of foreign medical volunteers." She held up her left hand, the glove tight against her fingers. They were particularly creative in their questioning techniques. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the hospital announcements over the PA system, the ding of elevator doors, the steady rhythm of an institution dedicated to healing. It seemed almost obscene that such normalcy could exist, in the same world as the reality Elena had just described. "But you didn't tell them," Torres said. It wasn't a question. Elena's smile was thin, sharp as a scalpel. "Captain, I've spent my entire career putting people back together. I know exactly how much the human body can endure before it breaks completely. I also know exactly how much pain it can absorb while keeping the mind intact." She flexed her fingers inside the gloves, and Torres caught a glimpse of scar tissue at her wrist where the leather ended. They never got what they wanted. Torres felt something shift in his chest, a combination of respect, horror, and a protective instinct he hadn't experienced since his last deployment. This woman sitting across from his desk, wearing a simple gray sweater and speaking with the calm professionalism of someone discussing a medical procedure, had endured torture that would have broken most people. And yet here she was, working in his hospital, healing others, carrying her scars like hidden armor. How did you get out? He asked. Alina stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where off-duty staff sometimes took their lunch breaks. A group of nurses sat at a picnic table, laughing at something on one of their phones, their joy a stark contrast to the conversation happening in the office above them. There was an airstrike, she said, her voice distant. Not intentional, just bad luck for the security building where they were keeping me. A rebel rocket hit the generator, and in the chaos that followed, some very brave people risked their lives to get me out. She turned back to Torres, her expression unreadable. 6 months later, I was Elena Vasquez, emergency medicine resident at Riverside Memorial Hospital, ready to start over in a country where the worst trauma we see usually involves car accidents and heart attacks. Torres stood and joined her at the window. Below them, the nurses had been joined by a group of residents, their animated discussion suggesting a debate about treatment protocols, or perhaps just weekend plans. The normalcy of it struck him again, how remarkable it was that healing could happen alongside such profound hidden pain. Why are you telling me this? He asked. Elena looked at him sharply, as if the question surprised her. Because you asked. Because you recognize something in those scars that most people would have ignored or explained away. Because ... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Because in 3 years, you're the first person who's looked at me like you understand. That survival sometimes comes with a price. Torres nodded slowly. During his tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, he'd met local doctors and nurses who'd faced similar choices: treat everyone who needed help, regardless of their politics or affiliations, and risk becoming targets themselves. He'd seen the results of interrogations, the aftermath of detention centers, the way trauma could reshape not just bodies, but entire identities. Does anyone else know? He asked. My attending physician, Dr. Richards, knows some of it. The hospital administration has my background check, but it shows Elena Vasquez, refugee granted asylum, not. She gestured vaguely at herself, not whatever I was before. The State Department was very thorough in creating my new identity. Torres absorbed this information, understanding its implications. Elena wasn't just a doctor with a traumatic past, she was someone whose very presence at the hospital had been orchestrated at the highest levels of government. Someone valuable enough to extract from a war zone, important enough to give a complete new life. The titanium fragments, he said suddenly. They're not from the torture, are they? Elena's face went completely still, and Torres realized he'd stumbled onto something even more significant than her captivity. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made his previous military clearance seem suddenly inadequate. Captain Torres, she said formally, there are some things that are better left unexamined. Some secrets that protect more than just the person carrying them. But Torres was a man who'd spent his career reading between lines and understanding the gaps in official reports. The way Elena held herself, the precision with which she described her torture, the careful way she'd mentioned her extraction, it all pointed to something larger than a simple rescue mission. You weren't just treating rebel fighters, he said quietly. You were one of them. Elena turned away from the window, her expression closing off like shutters being pulled across glass. I was a doctor, Captain. I took an oath to do no harm. To heal without regard for politics or nationality or ideology. That oath doesn't change based on which government happens to be in power. But the fragments are a reminder, Elena cut him off, that some prices are worth paying, and that some stories are too dangerous to tell, even to people who might understand them. She moved toward the door, their conversation clearly over. But Torres couldn't let her leave without asking the question that had been building since the moment the metal detector screamed. Dr. Vasquez, he said, and she paused with her hand on the doorknob. Are you safe here? I mean, truly safe? Elena looked back at him, and for just a moment, her careful mask slipped. He saw exhaustion there, bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. But he also saw determination, the kind of resolve that had kept her alive through 6 months of torture and carried her halfway around the world to start again. "Captain," she said, "I've learned that safety is relative. What I have here," she gestured toward the window, toward the hospital and the staff and the normal life she'd built, "is more than I ever expected to have again. It's enough." She left then, closing the door softly behind her, leaving Torres alone with questions that would keep him awake that night and many nights after. He returned to his desk and opened his computer, cursor blinking in the search field. But after a long moment, he closed it again without typing anything. Some secrets, he realized, were meant to be kept. Meanwhile, Elena made her way through the hospital corridors toward the emergency department, her gloves firmly in place, her expression once again composed. She passed the security checkpoint where Martinez was helping an elderly man navigate the metal detector, the machine functioning normally, giving no sign of the drama that had unfolded there earlier. Dr. Sarah Chun was waiting by the elevator bank, clearly having lingered in hope of another encounter. When she saw Elena approaching, she stepped forward with the kind of careful determination that marked her as someone unaccustomed to backing down from difficult conversations. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, "I wanted to apologize for everyone staring earlier. That wasn't professional." Elena studied her face, taking in the genuine concern there, the way Sarah's eyes kept flicking to Elena's gloved hands as if trying to see through the leather to the truth beneath. "Dr. Chen," Elena replied, "in my experience, people stare because they don't understand. It's not malicious, it's human nature. You have nothing to apologize for." Sarah nodded, but she didn't move away. "I specialize in pediatric trauma," she said after a moment. "I see a lot of children who've been hurt in ways that in ways that leave more than just physical scars. If you ever want to talk, or if you need someone who understands that healing isn't always about fixing what's broken." The elevator arrived with a soft chime, its doors sliding open to reveal an empty car. Elena stepped inside, then turned to face Sarah, her finger hovering over the button panel. "Dr. Chun," she said, "what makes you think I need healing?" Sarah met her gaze directly. "Because I recognize the way you hold yourself, the way you watch doorways and keep your back to walls, the way you flinched when that security guard raised his voice, even though he wasn't angry." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I recognize it because I see it in my patients who've survived things that children should never have to survive." Elena's finger pressed the button for the emergency department, and the doors began to close. But just before they shut completely, she spoke one last time. "Dr. Chun," she said, "children aren't the only ones who sometimes need to learn how to trust the world again." The doors closed, leaving Sarah alone in the corridor, staring at her own reflection in the polished metal surface, already knowing that her encounter with Elena Vasquez had changed something fundamental about how she understood both trauma and healing. The morning alarm at 4:47 a.m. wasn't necessary. Elena had been awake for 23 minutes already, lying in the pre-dawn darkness of her studio apartment, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood coming to life. The garbage trucks rumbling down Maple Street, their hydraulic whines and mechanical groans, forming the percussion section of an urban symphony she'd memorized during 3 years of sleepless dawns. Mrs. Chen next door, not related to Dr. Sarah Chun, just one of those coincidences that sometimes made Elena wonder if the universe had a sense of humor, was already in her kitchen. The soft clink of teacups and the whisper of slippers on linoleum carrying through walls that seemed designed to share rather than separate lives. Elena's apartment was a study in careful minimalism. Not the Instagram-worthy kind that spoke of aesthetic choices, but the practical minimalism of someone who'd learned that possessions could become anchors in situations where mobility meant survival. The furniture was functional, a bed that doubled as a couch, a small table that served for eating and working, 2 chairs in case she ever had a guest, though in 3 years that had happened exactly twice. Both times Dr. Richards checking on her after particularly difficult shifts. The walls held no photographs, no art, nothing that might suggest a past worth remembering or a future worth planning. Instead, there were medical journals stacked in precise piles, their pages marked with notes in handwriting that was still adjusting to writing left-handed. The damage to her right hand wasn't visible like the scars on her left, but it was their nerve damage that made fine motor control inconsistent, turning once graceful surgical movements into exercises in adaptation and willpower. Elena's morning routine was as precise as a surgical procedure, each step performed in the same order, at the same time, with the same meticulous attention to detail. Shower first, always facing the door, never with her back to the bathroom entrance, a habit that had taken months to develop but now felt as natural as breathing. The water temperature exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, body temperature warm. Enough to relax muscles still tight from dreams. She couldn't quite remember, but never quite forgot. The mirror above the sink was her daily checkpoint, the place where Elena Vasquez looked back at someone who had once been Dr. Amira Kassim but could never be her again. The face was the same olive skin, dark eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow from childhood, running into a neighbor's fence while chasing a soccer ball. But everything else had changed. The way she held her mouth, the set of her shoulders, the careful control of expressions that might reveal too much to observers who didn't need to know. She brushed her teeth with her left hand, the dominant hand now by necessity rather than nature. Such a small thing, really, but it served as a daily reminder of adaptation, of the body's remarkable ability to compensate, to find new pathways when the old ones had been damaged beyond repair. The toothbrush was electric, compensating for the reduced dexterity, and she'd learned to appreciate these small accommodations that made normal life possible. The gloves came next, always. Black leather during winter, lighter brown during summer, but always present, always perfect. She'd learned to put them on without looking, muscle memory guiding her fingers into the protective covering that had become as essential as skin itself. The leather was soft now, broken in through constant wear, forming to the unique topography of her scars like a second skin, designed specifically for hiding what lay beneath. Coffee was a ritual Elena had adopted from her American colleagues. Though she prepared it Turkish style in a small sezv her grandmother had given her for her medical school graduation. The irony wasn't lost on her. This small copper pot had somehow survived her journey from Syria to America while so much else had been lost or abandoned. She'd found it in her recovered belongings when she finally moved into this apartment, wrapped in one of her mother's headscarves, both items somehow spared from the systematic destruction of Dr. Amira Kassim's life. As the coffee brewed, filling the apartment with aromas that could transport her across oceans and years if she let them, Elena reviewed the day ahead. Tuesday shift in the emergency department, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., with Dr. Martinez covering trauma calls and Dr. Patel handling the usual parade of chest pains, broken bones, and cases of questionable decision-making that formed the backbone of emergency medicine. She'd learned to love this work, the immediacy of it, the way each patient presented a puzzle to be solved quickly and efficiently, leaving little time for the kind of deep thinking that could lead to dangerous territory. The walk to Riverside Memorial took exactly 18 minutes at her preferred pace, a route she'd mapped and memorized during her first week, including alternate paths in case the primary route was blocked. Elena had learned never to depend on a single escape plan, never to assume that today would necessarily resemble yesterday in any meaningful way. The neighborhood around the hospital was diverse, working class, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about their neighbors. Histories. She passed Martinez's corner store, where the elderly man who'd struggled through the metal detector yesterday was now buying lottery tickets and complaining about his grandchildren's lack of respect for their elders. He nodded to Elena as she passed, the kind of polite acknowledgement neighbors shared without needing to know each other's names or stories. It was exactly the level of human connection Elena had learned to appreciate, present enough to feel part of a community, distant enough to maintain the anonymity that kept her safe. The hospital's morning shift change was a carefully choreographed dance Elena had watched hundreds of times without ever getting bored. Night shift nurses clustered around the coffee station, their fatigue evident in the way they held their shoulders, the careful precision of their movements that spoke of professionals running on caffeine and determination. Day shift doctors arrived with the particular energy of people who'd had full nights of sleep. At least theoretically, their conversations bright with plans and complaints and the small dramas that filled normal lives. Elena changed into her scrubs. In the women's locker room, a space filled with the comfortable chatter of colleagues who'd known each other for years, who shared stories about children and mortgages and weekend plans with the easy intimacy of shared purpose. She listened without participating, learning about Dr. Thompson's teenagers' soccer tournament and Nurse Williams' mother's recovery from hip surgery, storing these details not out of genuine interest, but because understanding the people around her had become a survival skill. Her hands were steady as she pulled on the latex gloves that went over her leather ones, a double barrier that some of her colleagues found odd but had learned not to question. Elena had explained it as a skin condition, sensitive to latex, and in a profession where people dealt with bodily fluids and infectious materials daily, the explanation was accepted without further inquiry. The emergency department at 7 a.m. was a different world from the chaos that would develop by midday. Early morning brought a specific type of patient heart attacks that had developed overnight, accidents involving people heading to work early, domestic violence situations that had escalated during the long dark hours when problems seemed larger and solutions smaller. Elena had learned to read the rhythm of these mornings, to anticipate the flow of patients and problems that would shape her day. Dr. Richards, her attending physician and the closest thing she had to a friend in this new life, was already at the central desk, reviewing charts and making notes in handwriting that somehow managed to be both illegible and precise. He looked up as Elena approached, his expression carrying the particular warmth he reserved for residents who'd proven themselves capable of handling whatever the day might bring. "Morning, Elena," he said, and she noted that he never called her Dr. Vasquez during their informal interactions, though she'd never explicitly given him permission to use her first name. It was one of the small ways he showed that he understood something about her situation, that the formality of titles and hierarchy meant less when someone was trying to rebuild their entire identity from scratch. "Good morning, Dr. Richards. What's the overnight situation?" Richards handed her a tablet loaded with patient information, his fingers briefly touching her gloved ones, a contact so casual and professional that it would have been meaningless to anyone else, but which Elena recognized as his way of checking on her, making sure she was steady and ready for whatever the shift might bring. Chest pain in 3, probable ALMI, already called cardiology. MVA in 5, nothing serious but the passenger's pregnant and anxious, and we've got a pediatric case in 7, that's... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That's going to require some sensitivity." Elena nodded, understanding the subtext. Pediatric cases that required sensitivity usually involved suspected abuse, situations that demanded not just medical expertise but the ability to navigate complex family dynamics, legal requirements, and the particular kind of heartbreak that came from seeing children harmed by the adults meant to protect them. "I'll take 7, she said without hesitation. And Richard's expression shifted to something that might have been relief or might have been respect. "Elena," he said quietly, "you know you don't have to take all the difficult cases, right?" There are other residents who can handle. Dr. Richards, Elena interrupted gently. Difficult cases are why I became a doctor. She moved toward room 7, her steps measured and professional. But inside her chest something tightened with the familiar combination of determination and dread that came from knowing she was about to face another child whose world had been damaged by adult cruelty. These cases were the hardest and yet somehow the most necessary. The moments when her own experience with surviving trauma became not just personal history but professional qualification. The little girl in room 7 was maybe 5 years old, sitting on the examination table with the particular stillness of children who'd learned that moving too much or making too much noise could have consequences. Her mother sat in the chair beside her, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, eyes darting between her daughter and the door, as if calculating distances and escape routes. Behavior Elena recognized with the clarity of shared experience. "Hello," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the warmth she'd learned to summon for pediatric patients, a tone that suggested safety without making promises she might not be able to keep. "I'm Dr. Vasquez. What's your name?" The little girl looked at her mother before answering, another learned behavior that made Elena's chest tighten. "Lucy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the emergency department. "That's a beautiful name," Elena said, pulling up a rolling stool so she could sit at Lucy's eye level rather than looming over her. "Lucy, I'm going to ask your mom some questions, and then I'm going to examine you to make sure you're okay. Is that all right?" Lucy nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on Elena's hands, on the black leather gloves that covered them. Elena followed her gaze and felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. "Lucy," she said carefully, "do you like my gloves?" The little girl nodded again, more enthusiastically this time. "They're pretty. Why do you wear them?" Elena glanced at Lucy's mother, noting the woman's increased tension, the way her breathing had become shallow and quick. "I wear them because my hands were hurt a long time ago," Elena said simply. "The gloves help protect them and make them feel better." Lucy's eyes widened with recognition and something that might have been relief. "My daddy hurt my hands too," she said, holding up her small palms to reveal bruises in the distinctive pattern of adult fingertips, marks that spoke of being grabbed too hard, held too tight, controlled through pain. Elena felt the familiar surge of rage that came with these revelations. The same anger that had driven her to treat rebel fighters in Damascus, that had sustained her through 6 months of torture, that now fueled her dedication to healing children who'd been broken by adults who should have known better. But she kept her voice gentle, professional, warm. "I'm sorry your daddy hurt your hands, Lucy," she said. "That wasn't okay. Grown-ups should never hurt children's hands." Lucy's mother began to cry then, quiet tears that spoke of guilt and fear, and the terrible weight of choices made under impossible circumstances. Elena looked at her with compassion rather than judgment, understanding that domestic violence created victims on multiple levels, that the woman sitting in this chair was probably as trapped and frightened as her daughter. The examination that followed was careful, thorough, and heartbreaking. Lucy's injuries were extensive but not life-threatening bruises in various stages of healing. Small burns from cigarettes, the kind of systematic abuse that spoke of ongoing trauma rather than isolated incidents. Elena documented everything with clinical precision while part of her mind was already planning the conversations she'd need to have with social services, with the police, with the hospital's child advocacy team. But it was when Lucy asked to see Elena's hands that the morning took an unexpected turn. "Can I see under your gloves?" Lucy asked with the directness that only children possessed. "Do they hurt like mine do?" Elena looked at Lucy's mother, who nodded through her tears, and then at the child whose trust she'd somehow earned despite their brief acquaintance. Slowly, carefully, she peeled back the glove on her left hand, revealing the scars that told their own story of survival and healing. Lucy stared at Alana's fingertips with the wide-eyed fascination children brought to things adults tried to hide from them. "Wow," she whispered, reaching out to touch one of the scars with gentle curiosity. "Did it hurt a lot?" "Yes," Elena said honestly. "It hurt very much. But the hurt doesn't last forever, Lucy. Bodies are very good at healing, and people are very good at learning to feel safe again." Lucy nodded solemnly, as if filing this information away for future reference. "Will my hands look like yours?" "No," Elena said with certainty, "because we're going to make sure the person who hurt you doesn't get to hurt you anymore. And we're going to help your hands heal properly, so they'll be strong and healthy." It was then that Dr. Sarah Chun appeared in the doorway, her presence unexpected, but somehow not unwelcome. Elena looked up in surprise, wondering what had brought the pediatric surgeon to her examination room. "Dr. Vasquez," Sarah said formally, "I wondered if you might want a consultation on your pediatric case." Elena understood immediately that this wasn't about medical necessity. Sarah had somehow intuited the nature of the situation and was offering backup, support, the kind of professional solidarity that transcended departmental boundaries when children were involved. "Dr. Chun," Elena replied, "I'd welcome your input." Sarah entered the room and knelt beside Lucy's chair, her manner gentle but confident. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Dr. Chun. I help take care of children who've been hurt, and I think you're very brave for coming to see us today." Lucy looked between Elena and Sarah, taking in their professional attire, their kind expressions, their obvious competence. "Are you going to make the hurting stop?" she asked with the devastating directness of childhood. "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation, "we are. Both the hurting in your hands and the hurting in your heart. It might take some time, but we're going to make sure you're safe." Elena watched Sarah interact with Lucy and her mother, noting the skill with which she handled the complex dynamics of abuse cases, the way she managed to convey authority and compassion simultaneously. It was a delicate balance, being strong enough to ensure the child's protection while remaining gentle enough not to add to their trauma. Over the next 2 hours, Elena and Sarah worked together to complete Lucy's care. Social services arrived, led by Maria Santos, a caseworker whose own childhood experiences had driven her into protective services. The police came next, Officer Janet Rodriguez, whose questions were thorough but kind, designed to gather necessary evidence without re-traumatizing a child who'd already endured too much. Lucy's mother, whose name Elena learned was Jennifer Walsh, sat through the interviews with the exhausted resignation of someone who'd known this day was coming, but had hoped against hope to avoid it. When the social worker explained that Lucy would need to be placed in protective custody while the investigation proceeded, Jennifer broke down completely, her sobs echoing through the examination room like a prayer for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. "Mrs. Walsh," Elena said quietly, sitting beside the crying woman while Sarah distracted Lucy with medical equipment and gentle conversation, "you did the right thing bringing her here. You saved your daughter's life." Jennifer looked up through her tears, mascara streaking her cheeks in dark rivers. "I should have left him sooner. I should have been stronger. I should have protected her better." Elena felt the familiar ache of recognition, the understanding that came from her own experience with impossible choices and their inevitable consequences. "Mrs. Walsh, survival isn't always about being strong enough to fight. Sometimes it's about being smart enough to know when to ask for help." As Lucy was prepared for transport to the children's hospital where she'd receive specialized care, she turned back to Elena one last time. "Dr. Vasquez," she said with the solemnity of someone far older than her 5 years, "will you remember me?" Elena knelt beside the stretcher, her gloved hand resting gently on Lucy's arm. "Lucy, I will remember you every single day. And someday, when you're all grown up and your hands are strong and healthy, I hope you'll remember that even when people hurt us, we can still learn to trust good people again." Lucy nodded, clutching a small stuffed elephant that one of the nurses had brought from the pediatric supply closet. As she was wheeled away, surrounded by professionals dedicated to her protection and healing, Elena felt the complex mix of satisfaction and sorrow that came from knowing she'd helped save a child while being unable to undo the damage that had already been done. Sarah remained behind after the others had left, helping Elena complete the extensive documentation required in abuse cases. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, their shared focus creating a sense of partnership that felt both professional and personal. "That was beautifully handled," Sarah said finally, not looking up from her notes. "The way you connected with her, showed her your scars, that was exactly what she needed." Elena paused in her writing, considering how to respond. "Children who've been hurt recognize others who understand pain," she said eventually. She needed to know she wasn't alone. Sarah set down her pen and looked directly at Elena. "Is that why you became a doctor? To help people who weren't alone?" The question hung between them, more personal than professional, carrying weight that extended beyond their immediate situation. Elena found herself considering not just Sarah's question, but the woman asking it, the genuine concern in her eyes, the way she'd appeared at exactly the right moment to offer support, the skill with which she'd handled Lucy's case. "Dr. Chun," Elena said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Yesterday, when you offered to talk, to help, what made you think I needed either of those things?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of professional experience mixed with personal insight. "Because I see the way you position yourself in rooms, always near exits, never with your back fully turned to doors. I notice how you flinch when people move too quickly, how you watch faces for signs of anger or aggression that most people would miss." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "And because yesterday, when those scars were revealed, you didn't try to hide them out of shame. You covered them again out of protection, for yourself and for everyone else who wasn't ready to see them." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of defenses she'd maintained for 3 years. "You notice a great deal, Dr. Chun." "Sarah," she corrected gently, "and yes, I do. It's part of my job, but it's also who I am. I grew up in a house where noticing details could mean the difference between a good day and a bad one." The admission hung in the air between them, an offering of shared experience that Elena hadn't expected. She studied Sarah's face, seeing now what she'd missed before, the careful control, the professional competence that masked something deeper, more personal. "Your father?" Elena asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "Alcoholic. Functional most of the time. But when he WSN single quotes to ... she gestured vaguely at herself. "I learned to read moods and anticipate problems and become invisible when necessary. It's served me well in medicine, but it's not always the healthiest way to navigate relationships." Elena felt the unfamiliar sensation of meeting someone who might actually understand the careful choreography of survival, the way trauma could shape not just healing but the approach to healing itself. "How long have you known about my ... situation?" "I suspected something yesterday after the security incident. But honestly, I didn't know anything for certain until just now. Watching you with Lucy, the way you handled her case, the instincts you showed, those don't come from textbooks or residency training, they come from lived experience." Elena closed her patient file and leaned back in her chair, suddenly feeling the weight of 3 years of careful isolation, of maintaining professional distance while desperately craving human connection. "Sarah, what I told Captain Torres yesterday about my background is none of my business unless you want it to be," Sarah interrupted. "Elena, I'm not asking you to share anything you're not ready to share. I'm just saying that if you ever want to talk to someone who understands that survival sometimes requires reinventing yourself, I'm available." The lunch break that followed was the first meal, Elena had shared with a colleague outside of required hospital functions in 3 years. Sarah had suggested the small cafe across the street from the hospital, a place called Maria's Kitchen that specialized in comfort food and attracted hospital staff looking for something more substantial than vending machine options. They sat in a booth near the back, Elena automatically choosing the seat that faced the door while Sarah settled across from her without comment. The menu was simple sandwiches, soups, daily specials written on a chalkboard in cheerful colors that seemed designed to counteract the institutional atmosphere of the medical district. "Tell me about your family," Sarah said after they'd ordered. The question casual but clearly intentional. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. That came with questions about her past, but something in Sarah's tone suggested genuine interest rather than prying curiosity. "My parents were both doctors," she said carefully. "My father was a cardiologist, my mother a pediatrician. They met during their residencies in London. My mother was Syrian, my father Palestinian, but they both studied in England." "Were?" Elena's hand tightened around her coffee cup, the ceramic warm against her gloved palm. "They were killed in an airstrike 2 years before I was taken. They were volunteering at a refugee camp clinic near the Turkish border when the building was hit." Sarah's expression shifted to one of deep sympathy mixed with professional understanding. As a pediatric surgeon, she'd seen enough tragedy to know that some losses couldn't be processed or healed, only incorporated into the ongoing work of living. "I'm sorry," Sarah said simply, the words carrying more weight than elaborate condolences would have managed. Elena nodded, appreciating the directness. "They would have liked this," she said, gesturing at the hospital across the street, at the normalcy of sharing lunch with a colleague, at the simple act of discussing patients and cases without fear of government surveillance or retribution. Their food arrived, brought by an elderly woman whose accent suggested she was the Maria for whom the cafe was named. She set down Elena's soup and Sarah's sandwich, with the care of someone who understood that hospital workers needed more than just nutrition. They needed the comfort that came from being served rather than serving, from being cared for rather than constantly caring for others. "Tell me about Lucy," Elena said, deflecting the conversation away from her own history. "What happens next for her?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah's expression became professional again, though the personal warmth remained. "She'll stay at Children's Hospital while the investigation continues. Physical therapy for her hands, psychological counseling, educational support. Her father's been arrested, which is good. It means she's immediately safer. Her mother will likely face charges too, but given the circumstances, probably nothing that would prevent eventual reunification if she completes treatment programs." Elena nodded, understanding the complex legal and social dynamics that surrounded abuse cases. "And her long-term prognosis?" "Physically, excellent. Children heal remarkably well from this type of trauma if they get proper care. Emotionally." Sarah paused, considering her words. "That depends on a lot of factors. The quality of her placement, the consistency of her therapy, her own resilience. But she has advantages she's young enough that with proper support, this doesn't have to define her entire life." Elena thought about Lucy's small hand touching her scars, the child's acceptance of damage that adults would have found disturbing or uncomfortable. "She's stronger than people will give her credit for," Elena said quietly. "Most survivors are," Sarah replied, and the statement carried weight that extended beyond their discussion of Lucy's case. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Elena found herself studying Sarah's hands as she handled her sandwich unmarked. Steady, the hands of someone who'd dedicated her life to healing, but who'd been fortunate enough never to be a patient in the kind of situations they both treated professionally. "Sarah," Elena said eventually, "may I ask why you chose pediatric surgery?" Specifically trauma? Sarah set down her sandwich and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because children don't choose their circumstances, she said finally. Adults make decisions that put children in danger, and then other adults have to figure out how to fix the damage. I wanted to be one of the adults who fixes things rather than one who breaks them. Elena felt a recognition so strong it was almost physical, the understanding. That shared purpose could create connection even across vastly different backgrounds and experiences. That's why I became a doctor too, she said. Though the path got complicated. Sarah's eyes met hers across the table. The best paths usually do, she said simply. The rest of their lunch was spent discussing cases, hospital politics, and the small details of professional life that Elena had been observing from a distance for 3 years, but never participating indirectly. Sarah told her about the research project she was developing, studying trauma recovery in pediatric patients. Elena shared her thoughts on emergency medicine protocols, her observations about patient flow and resource allocation, insights she'd kept to herself but which felt safe to voice in this small cafe with someone who listened without judgment. When they returned to the hospital, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving in America, the sense of having a colleague who might actually become a friend. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, because friendships required trust, and trust required honesty about who she really was and what she'd really experienced. But as they parted ways in the hospital lobby, Sarah heading to surgery and Elena returning to the emergency department, Sarah turned back with a suggestion that would change everything. Elena, she called, there's a conference next month. Trauma Recovery and Resilience in Vulnerable Populations. It's here in the city, just a day-long symposium. I'm presenting some of my research, but I thought ... If you're interested in that kind of work, you might want to attend. Elena paused, understanding that this was more than just a professional invitation. It was an opportunity to engage with her field in a way she hadn't since leaving Syria, to contribute knowledge she'd gained through experience rather than just textbooks. I'll think about it, she said, and meant it. The afternoon brought a steady stream of typical emergency cases: a construction worker with a lacerated hand, an elderly woman with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety, a teenager who'd attempted to pierce his own ear with predictably unfortunate results. Elena moved through these cases with practiced efficiency, but part of her mind kept returning to her conversation with Sarah, to the possibility that she might be ready to engage more deeply with her profession, and by extension, with the life she'd built in America. It was during a brief lull in patient flow that Dr. Richards approached her with an unusual request. Elena, he said, I've had a call from Dr. Patricia Williams at the State Medical Board. She's been reviewing your file as part of some routine credentialing updates, and she'd like to meet with you. Elena felt the familiar surge of anxiety that came with any official attention, any deviation from the carefully maintained routine that had kept her safe for 3 years. Did she say what specifically she wanted to discuss? Richard's expression was carefully neutral, the look he wore when navigating sensitive professional territory. She mentioned that your background check flagged some inconsistencies in your educational records. Nothing serious, she emphasized, just some documentation that needs clarification. Elena's blood went cold. Her new identity had been created by professionals, but she'd always known that eventually someone with enough authority and motivation might dig deeply enough to find the careful constructions that held her new life together. Dr. Richards, she said carefully, am I in trouble? Richards looked at her with the paternal concern he'd shown since her first day of residency. Elena, as far as I'm concerned, you're one of the most competent residents I've worked with in 20 years of practice. Your patient care is exemplary, your clinical knowledge is outstanding, and your work ethic is beyond reproach. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Whatever questions Dr. Williams might have about paperwork or documentation, they don't change the fact that you're an excellent doctor who belongs exactly where you are. Elena nodded, understanding that this was Richard's way of saying he knew more about her situation than he'd ever explicitly acknowledged, and that his support was both professional and personal. "When does she want to meet?" Elena asked. "Next week. I've scheduled it during your research day, so it won't interfere with your patient care responsibilities." As Elena finished her shift and prepared to leave the hospital, she found herself thinking about the day's convergence of events: Lucy's case, her lunch with Sarah, and now this summons from the medical board. It felt like the careful equilibrium she'd maintained for 3 years was beginning to shift, pushed by forces both internal and external towards some kind of resolution she couldn't yet anticipate. The evening walk home took her past the same familiar landmarks: Martinez's store, now closed for the day, the bus stop where she'd waited during her first winter when she hadn't yet saved enough money for a car, the small park where she sometimes sat on benches and watched children play while wondering what normal childhood looked like. Her apartment felt different when she entered it, as if her conversation with Sarah had somehow changed the space itself. The careful minimalism that had once felt like protection now seemed more like isolation. The medical journals stacked on her table were still there, still marked with her notes, but now they felt like preparation for something rather than just maintenance of knowledge she might never use again. Elena made her evening coffee in the small copper sieve, letting the familiar ritual ground her in the present moment. As she sipped the strong, sweet brew, she thought about Lucy's question, "Will you remember me?" The answer was yes, of course, but not just because of the child's courage or the successful intervention. She would remember Lucy because the little girl had seen Elena's scars and recognized them not as sources of shame, but as evidence of survival, as proof that healing was possible even after terrible damage. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Elena fell asleep without checking the locks on her door twice, without positioning herself where she could see both the entrance and the fire escape, without running through escape routes and emergency contacts in her mind. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, her gloved hands relaxed on top of the blanket, no longer clenched into the defensive positions that had marked her nights since Damascus. And in her sleep, she didn't know that across the city, Dr. Sarah Chun was reading research papers about torture recovery and international medical volunteers, trying to understand the intersection of trauma and healing that might help her better support a colleague who was becoming something more than a colleague. She didn't know that Captain Torres was staring at his computer screen, cursor blinking in a search field he'd opened and closed a dozen times, wrestling with the knowledge that some secrets were meant to be kept and others were too dangerous to ignore. She didn't know that Dr. Patricia Williams at the State Medical Board was reviewing files that contained more questions than answers, documents that had been carefully constructed to hide a truth that national security interests required to remain hidden, and she didn't know that in a small apartment across town, Lucy Walsh was sleeping in her first safe bed in years, clutching her stuffed elephant and telling her foster mother about the doctor with the pretty gloves who had promised that the hurting would stop. But Elena did know, in the deep wisdom that came from having survived the unsurvivable, that the careful isolation she'd maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack. Whether that cracking would lead to healing or to danger remained to be seen, but change was coming, as inevitable as sunrise, as necessary as breath. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under Elena's apartment door while she was at work, discovered when she returned from a particularly brutal 16-hour shift that had included 2 cardiac arrests, a multi-vehicle accident, and a domestic violence case that had reminded her too painfully of Lucy's situation. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking, with her name typed across the front in a font that suggested official business rather than personal correspondence. Elena stared at it for a full minute before picking it up, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by the hypervigilance that 3 years of apparent safety hadn't completely erased. The return address showed only a post office box number, but the postmark was local, dated 2 days earlier. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper with a message that made her blood turn to ice. Dr. Amira Qasim, we know who you are. We know what you did in Damascus. We know about the rebels you treated, the safe houses you supported, the intelligence you gathered. Most importantly, we know about the files you stole. You have built a comfortable life as Elena Vasquez, but comfort can disappear as quickly as it appeared. There are people who have not forgotten what you took from them. People who have spent 3 years looking for the woman who disappeared from a basement cell that should have been her tomb. We want what you stole. You have 72 hours to make contact. The method will be obvious to someone with your background. If you refuse, or if you involve law enforcement, your new friends at Riverside Memorial Hospital will learn exactly who they've been working alongside. Some debts can never be paid. Some secrets can never stay buried. Some people can never truly escape. You have 69 hours remaining. Elena's hands shook as she read the message a second time, then a third, each word searing itself into her memory with the precision of traumatic recall. The paper fell from her fingers, drifting to the floor like a leaf from a dying tree, and she found herself sitting heavily on her small couch, staring at the wall where she'd never hung pictures, because pictures suggested permanence, suggested a future worth documenting. The files. They knew about the files. In the chaos of her extraction from Damascus, in the blur of safe houses and forged documents and midnight flights to countries whose names she'd been told to forget, Elena had managed to preserve something that her rescuers hadn't known about. Hidden in a false bottom of her medical bag, encrypted on a drive no larger than her thumbnail, were detailed records of everything she'd witnessed during her months of captivity: names, dates, locations, methods. Evidence of war crimes that could bring down government officials, expose international conspiracies, destroy careers and possibly governments. She'd kept the drive as insurance, initially, then as a memorial to the people who died because she couldn't save them. But over 3 years of safety in America, she'd almost convinced herself that the information was no longer relevant, that the war in Syria had moved past the particular horrors she'd documented, that her testimony would no longer matter to anyone in power. Apparently she'd been wrong. Elena stood and moved to her kitchen window, looking out at the ordinary street scene below: neighbors walking dogs, children playing in yards, the mail carrier making his afternoon rounds. The normalcy of it all seemed suddenly fragile, a thin veneer of civilization that could be stripped away with a single phone call, a whispered conversation, a strategic leak to the right journalist or government official. Her phone rang, the sound cutting through her thoughts like a scalpel. The number on the display was unknown, local area code, and Elena felt her heart rate spike as she answered. "Dr. Vasquez?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes, this is Dr. Patricia Williams from the State Medical Board, I believe. Dr. Richards mentioned that I'd be calling to schedule our meeting." Elena's relief was so intense it made her dizzy. Just administrative business. Just the routine complications of maintaining a false identity in a profession that required extensive documentation and verification. "Yes, Dr. Williams. When would be convenient?" "I have an opening tomorrow afternoon, if that works for your schedule. Say 2 p.m. at our downtown office." Elena calculated quickly. Tomorrow was Friday, which meant she could handle the meeting without missing critical patient care responsibilities, and the timing would give her something concrete to focus on instead of spiraling into paranoia about anonymous threats. "That works perfectly. Should I bring any specific documentation?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to suggest that Dr. Williams was consulting notes or perhaps choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Vasquez, I want to assure you that this is routine follow-up, nothing disciplinary. However, We have had some questions about your educational credentials that we'd like to clarify. If you have any original transcripts, diplomas, or other documentation from your medical training, it would be helpful to bring those. Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with official scrutiny of her background. The documents in her possession were expertly forged but not original, and she'd always known that eventually someone with the right expertise and motivation might dig deep enough to find the inconsistencies. "I'll bring what I have," she said carefully, after ending the call. Elena sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, not bothering to turn on lights, thinking through the implications of receiving the threatening letter on the same day as a call from the medical board. Coincidences were rare in her experience. Usually, when multiple pressures appeared simultaneously, it meant someone was orchestrating events from behind the scenes. She thought about calling Captain Torres, or Sarah, or even Dr. Richards, but the letter had been explicit about involving law enforcement, and she couldn't be sure that any conversation she had at the hospital would remain private. Instead, she did what she'd trained herself to do in moments of crisis. She made lists. What they wanted, the files she'd stolen from the Syrian security services, what they could do if she refused, expose her identity, destroy her career, possibly have her deported or arrested, what she could do, run again, disappear into another identity, abandon everything she'd built, or fight back using the very files they wanted as leverage. What she wouldn't do, put her colleagues at risk, endanger the patients she'd sworn to protect, compromise the hospital that had given her a chance at a new life. The decision, when it crystallized in her mind around midnight, felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would meet with Dr. Williams tomorrow, handle whatever questions the medical board might have about her credentials, and then she would disappear. Not because she was afraid. 3 years of building a life in America had reminded her that she was stronger than fear, but because staying would put other people in danger. Elena spent the night making preparations with the same methodical precision she brought to emergency medicine. She organized her few possessions, separating what she could carry from what she would have to abandon. She wrote letters to Dr. Richards, to Sarah, to Captain Torres, explaining as much as she could without compromising their safety. She transferred her small savings to an account that could be accessed from anywhere, closed her utility accounts, and composed an email to the hospital administration, explaining that a family emergency required her immediate departure. By dawn, Dr. Elena Vasquez was ready to cease existing, and Dr. Amira Qasim was preparing to emerge from her 3-year hibernation. The morning shift at the hospital felt surreal, knowing it would be her last. Elena moved through her patient care responsibilities with extra attention to detail, as if by being the best possible doctor for these final hours, she could somehow justify the abandonment that would follow. She treated a heart attack patient with meticulous care, sutured a construction worker's lacerated arm with perfect technique, and counseled a teenager through a panic attack with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Dr. Richards noticed her unusual intensity. During their morning briefing, "Elena, you seem focused today. More than usual, I mean." She looked at him, this man who'd been her mentor and protector for 3 years, who'd somehow known more about her situation than he'd ever acknowledged while still maintaining plausible deniability. "Dr. Richards, I wanted to tell you that working under your supervision has been the greatest honor of my medical career." His expression shifted to one of concern. "Elena, that sounds suspiciously like a goodbye." Elena managed a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just gratitude, Dr. Richards. Sometimes it's important to express appreciation while you have the chance." Sarah appeared at the nurse's station just before Elena's lunch break, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone with something important to discuss. "Elena, do you have a few minutes? There's something I wanted to talk to you about." They found a quiet corner in the hospital's small chapel, a non-denominational space designed to provide comfort to people of all faiths during their darkest Moments. Elena had never been religious, but she understood the power of sacred spaces, the way they could create pockets of peace even in the midst of chaos. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Sarah began, "about trauma and healing and the way past experiences shape how we approach patient care." Elena nodded, wondering if Sarah had somehow sensed the emotional goodbye she was attempting to navigate. "I want to propose something that might sound unusual," Sarah continued. "What if we collaborated on a research project? Something that combines your experience in emergency medicine with my work in pediatric trauma. I think together we could develop treatment protocols that would revolutionize how we approach patients who've experienced systematic abuse." The offer was everything Elena had dreamed of during her years in exile. The chance to use her knowledge and experience to help others, to contribute something meaningful to medical literature, to transform her survival into service. It was also impossible, given the letter waiting in her apartment and the meeting with the medical board that afternoon. "Sarah," Elena said carefully, "that sounds like incredibly important work." But Sarah's intuition was as sharp as her surgical skills. Elena looked around the chapel, at the simple wooden cross on one wall, the Star of David on another, the crescent moon and star that represented her own cultural heritage, symbols of different paths to the same destination of peace and healing. "Sarah, what would you do if you discovered that everything you'd built, everything you'd worked for, was based on foundations that could crumble at any moment?" Sarah studied Elena's face with the intensity she brought to examining X-rays or MRI results. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Elena felt the weight of 3 years of isolation pressing against her chest, the accumulated burden of secrets and half-truths and carefully maintained distances. For just a moment, she considered telling Sarah everything about Damascus, about the torture, about the files, about the letter and the impossible choice she was facing. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out one of the letters she'd written the night before. "Sarah, if something were to happen to me, if I had to leave suddenly, for reasons I can't explain, I want you to know that meeting you, working with you, has reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." Sarah took the letter with hands that Elena noticed were trembling slightly. "Elena, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Elena stood, understanding that she was crossing a line from which there might be no return. "Sarah, sometimes the best thing you can do for people you care about is to protect them from knowledge that could hurt them." She left the chapel then, walking quickly through corridors that had become as familiar as the streets of her childhood neighborhood, past nurses and doctors and patients who had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era. In the elevator, she closed her eyes and allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she was about to lose, the identity she was about to abandon, the relationship she was about to sever. The meeting with Dr. Williams was scheduled for 2 p.m., which gave Elena time to return to her apartment and prepare for whatever questions might be waiting. She drove her small Honda Civic through streets that looked different now that she knew she was seeing them for the last time, past landmarks that would become memories, through a city that would soon know her only as a name on medical licenses and apartment leases that would need to be explained to investigators. Dr. Patricia Williams' office was located in a downtown building that screamed bureaucratic efficiency: marble floors, fluorescent lighting, the kind of institutional architecture designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Elena announced herself to a receptionist who seemed professionally bored and was directed to a waiting area, filled with uncomfortable chairs and magazines that were exactly the wrong age to be either current or interestingly historical. When Dr. Williams finally called her into the inner office, Elena was surprised to find herself face to face with a woman who looked more like a college professor than a medical board investigator. Williams was perhaps 50, with graying hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that suggested both intelligence and compassion behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Vasquez, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." Williams gestured to a chair across from her desk. which was covered with files and documents in a way that suggested serious investigation rather than routine. Follow-up. Elena sat carefully, positioning herself where she could see both the door and the window, noting the location of Williams' phone and computer, automatically cataloging details that might become important if this meeting took an unexpected turn. "Dr. Vasquez," Williams began, "I want to be direct with you. We've been reviewing your credentials as part of a broader investigation into medical license fraud, and we've found some irregularities in your documentation." Elena's heart rate increased, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of irregularities?" Williams opened one of the files on her desk and spread out several documents, transcripts, diplomas, verification letters from medical schools and residency programs. Elena recognized them as the carefully forged papers that had established her new identity, documents that had passed initial scrutiny but apparently couldn't withstand deeper investigation. These transcripts from the University of London Medical School show some formatting inconsistencies with known authentic documents from that period. The verification letters from Damascus General Hospital bear signatures that don't match samples we've obtained from other authentic documents. And your residency completion certificate shows a date discrepancy that doesn't align with the hospital's records. Elena studied the documents, understanding that her careful facade was crumbling with the same inevitability that had characterized the collapse of her previous life. "Dr. Williams, I want to be completely honest with you." Williams leaned forward, her expression shifting from professional skepticism to genuine interest. "I'm listening." Elena took a breath, understanding that she was about to cross another point of no return, that honesty here might protect her colleagues, even if it destroyed her own carefully constructed safety. "My name is Elena Vasquez, and I am a qualified physician. But my educational credentials were modified as part of a federal witness protection program. I cannot provide you with original documents because doing so would compromise my safety and the safety of other people." Williams' eyebrows rose, but her expression remained professionally neutral. "Dr. Vasquez, are you telling me that your medical license is based on falsified documents?" "I'm telling you that my medical training is genuine, but the documentation of that training has been altered for security reasons by people with authority to make such alterations." Williams leaned back in her chair, clearly processing this information and its implications. "Dr. Vasquez, if what you're telling me is true, then this investigation is beyond the scope of the State Medical Board. This would be a matter for federal authorities." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Federal authorities meant investigations, background checks, the kind of official attention that could expose not just her identity but the entire network of people who had helped create her new life. "Dr. Williams, is there any way to handle this matter without involving additional agencies? I can provide character references, demonstrate my medical competence, submit to any testing you might require." Williams held up a hand to stop her. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand that you may be in a difficult situation, but if your credentials are fraudulent, even if they're fraudulent for legitimate reasons, the medical board has specific protocols we must follow." Elena nodded, understanding that the careful house of cards she'd built around her new identity was finally collapsing. "Dr. Williams, may I ask what happens next?" "I'll need to file a report with the appropriate federal agencies. Your medical license will be suspended pending investigation. You'll be prohibited from practicing medicine until this matter is resolved, which could take months or even years." Elena felt the weight of inevitability settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her career as Elena Vasquez was over, her life in America was ending, and the safe harbor she'd found at Riverside Memorial Hospital was about to become a memory. "Dr. Williams," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I have never done anything to harm a patient or compromise the integrity of medical care. Whatever irregularities you found in my documentation, they don't reflect any inadequacy in my training or commitment to medicine." Williams' expression softened slightly. Dr. Vasquez, for what it's worth, your patient care record is exemplary. Dr. Richards has nothing but praise for your work. Your colleagues respect you, and your clinical outcomes are outstanding. Whatever situation led to the documentation issues, it's clear that you're a competent physician who genuinely cares about helping people. Elena stood, understanding that the meeting was over and that her old life was officially ending. Thank you, Dr. Williams. I appreciate your professionalism in handling this matter. As Elena left the medical board building, stepping out into the afternoon sunshine that seemed too bright and cheerful for the gravity of what had just transpired, she understood that her timeline had just been accelerated. The anonymous letter had given her 72 hours, but Dr. Williams' investigation would set federal agencies in motion within days, possibly hours. She drove back to her apartment, mind racing through possibilities and contingencies, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize but somehow expected. Dr. Kassem. The voice was male, accented in a way that made Elena's chest tighten with recognition. I think you have the wrong number, Elena said automatically, though her hands were already shaking. No, doctor. I have exactly the right number. We need to talk. Elena pulled into a parking garage, seeking privacy and security for a conversation she'd hoped never to have. What do you want? What we've always wanted. What you stole from us. The files that contain names, locations, methods. Evidence that certain people would prefer remain buried. Elena closed her eyes, seeing again the basement room in Damascus, where she'd memorized every detail, documented every horror, preserved every piece of evidence that might someday bring justice to the victims whose screams still echoed in her dreams. Those files don't exist anymore, she lied. The man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Doctor, we know you better than you think. We know about your medical training, your dedication to preserving life, your compulsive need to document and heal. You wouldn't destroy evidence of war crimes any more than you would abandon a patient in cardiac arrest. Elena felt trapped between her past and present, between the doctor who had sworn to do no harm and the survivor who had learned that sometimes harm was the only way to prevent greater harm. What makes you think I still have anything you want? Because we've been watching you for 3 years, doctor. We've seen your careful routine, your methodical nature, your inability to truly let go of your previous life. We know you've kept the files, just as we know you've kept the small copper coffee pot your grandmother gave you, just as we know you've kept the photograph of your parents hidden in your medical bag. The specificity of the details made Elena's blood run cold. They'd been watching her, learning her habits, mapping her vulnerabilities with the same systematic precision she'd once applied to treating trauma patients. Even if I had such files, Elena said carefully, what would you offer in exchange? Your continued existence as Elena Vasquez, your colleagues' continued safety, the preservation of the illusion that you've built around your new life. Elena understood the implicit threat: cooperate, or watch everything and everyone she cared about be destroyed as collateral damage in a war that had followed her across oceans and years. I need time to consider your offer, she said. You have until tomorrow night. There's a storage facility on Industrial Boulevard, Unit 247. The key will be under the 3rd brick from the corner on the east wall. Leave the files there by midnight. Tomorrow, and this conversation never happened. The line went dead, leaving Elena alone in the parking garage with the weight of an impossible choice. She could surrender the evidence that might someday bring justice to the victims of systematic torture and war crimes, or she could watch her new life and the people in it be destroyed by forces she'd thought she'd escaped. She drove home through streets that no longer felt safe, past landmarks that now seemed like surveillance points, through a city that had transformed from sanctuary to battleground in the space of a single phone call. Back in her apartment, Elena stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the ordinary. Evenings seen neighbors arriving home from work, children playing in yards that seemed suddenly fragile and precious. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Are you okay? You seemed upset earlier. Want to talk?" Elena stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Rain check? Long day." Sarah's response came immediately. "Of course. But, Elena, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Some problems are too big to carry alone." Elena felt tears she hadn't shed in 3 years threatening to overflow. Sarah's kindness, offered without conditions or expectations, was almost harder to bear than the threats and ultimatums she'd received earlier. She spent the evening pulling up the floorboard in her bedroom closet, retrieving the small waterproof container she'd hidden there 3 years ago. Inside was the encrypted drive containing the files, along with a few other items from her previous life. The photograph of her parents her anonymous caller had mentioned, a small piece of jewelry her mother had worn, a letter her father had written her before his deployment to the refugee camp where he died. Elena held the drive up to the light. This tiny piece of technology that contained enough information to topple governments and expose war criminals, but which also represented the last connection to the people she'd tried to save and failed to protect. The names in those files belonged to rebels who had fought against oppression, civilians who had provided medical care regardless of politics, foreign volunteers who had risked their lives to help strangers in a war zone. They deserved justice. They deserved to have their stories told, their sacrifices recognized, their deaths investigated and avenged. But Elena also thought about Lucy, sleeping safely in her foster home, because a team of medical professionals had intervened to protect her. She thought about Sarah, whose research might help thousands of children recover from trauma. She thought about Dr. Richards, whose mentorship had given her a chance to heal while helping others heal. The utilitarian calculation was brutal in its simplicity: sacrifice the dead to protect the living, surrender evidence of past atrocities to prevent future ones. Elena made her decision with the same clinical detachment she brought to emergency medicine, separating emotion from necessity, personal desire from professional obligation. She would give them the files, but not before making one final attempt to ensure that justice might still be served. She spent the night copying the contents of the drive onto multiple backup devices, encrypting each one differently, preparing packages that could be mailed to journalists, human rights organizations, and international courts if something happened to her. The files would be surrendered, but the information they contained would survive in other forms, waiting for a safer time and better circumstances to emerge into the light. By dawn, Elena had prepared 7 different backup packages, each addressed to a different organization, each containing enough evidence to initiate investigations that could eventually lead to the same accountability she'd hoped to achieve more directly. She sealed them in envelopes addressed to locations across the globe: London, Geneva, New York, The Hague, and prepared them for mailing from different post offices throughout the city. The plan was simple: deliver the packages to various mailing points throughout the morning, then meet the blackmailer's demand by leaving the original drive in the storage unit. If she was allowed to continue her life as Elena Vasquez, the packages would remain undelivered, sitting in post office boxes until they were eventually discarded. But if anything happened to her, if she disappeared or died under suspicious circumstances, the packages would be retrieved by contacts she'd arranged through encrypted communications with human rights networks she'd once worked with. It was insurance, purchased at the cost of temporary compromise, but designed to ensure that her silence would be both conditional and revocable. Elena's morning shift at the hospital felt like moving through a dream, every interaction filtered through the knowledge that she might be seeing her colleagues for the last time. She treated patients with the same care and attention she always provided, but part of her mind was constantly calculating distances to exits, noting which staff members were present, memorizing details that might become important if her carefully laid plans went wrong. Dr. Richards found her during her lunch break, sitting in the hospital cafeteria and staring at a sandwich she hadn't touched. "Elena, you've seemed distracted lately. Is everything all right?" She looked up at him, this man who'd been both supervisor and protector, who'd somehow known enough about her situation to provide support without asking uncomfortable questions. "Dr. Richards, if something were to happen to me, if I had to leave. Suddenly, I want you to know that working under your guidance has been the most meaningful experience of my medical career." Richards sat down across from her, his expression shifting from casual concern to focused attention. "Elena, that's the second time in 2 days you've sounded like you're saying goodbye. What's going on?" Elena chose her words carefully, understanding that she needed to prepare him for her possible disappearance without revealing information that could put him in danger. "Dr. Richards, sometimes people's pasts catch up with them in ways that make staying in one place impossible. If that were to happen to me, I want you to know that it has nothing to do with my work here or my relationships with anyone at the hospital." Richards leaned forward, lowering his voice to prevent their conversation from being overheard. "Elena, are you in some kind of danger?" Elena met his eyes directly. "Dr. Richards, what would you do if protecting the people you cared about required sacrificing something important to you?" "I'd make the sacrifice," he replied without hesitation. "But I'd also make sure I had backup plans in case the sacrifice wasn't enough." Elena nodded, understanding that Richards was telling her he knew more about her situation than he'd ever admitted, and that he approved of whatever contingencies she might be developing. "Dr. Richards, if I don't see you again, please know that your faith in me gave me the courage to remember who I wanted to be, even when I'd forgotten who I used to be." She left the cafeteria then, walking through corridors that had become as familiar as the streets of her childhood, past colleagues who didn't know they were witnessing what might be her final shift as Elena Vasquez. The afternoon was spent mailing packages from 7 different post offices scattered across the city, each one representing a different potential future, a different possible outcome to the impossible choice she was navigating. At each location, Elena felt the weight of history and justice and sacrifice balancing against safety and survival and the protection of innocent people who had become important to her. The storage facility on Industrial Boulevard was exactly as anonymous and industrial as its location suggested, rows of identical units behind chain-link fencing, monitored by security cameras but staffed by minimum-wage employees who were trained to ignore anything that didn't directly threaten their property. Elena found the key where she'd been told it would be, opened Unit 247 to reveal an empty space that would soon contain evidence of crimes against humanity. She placed the encrypted drive in a small box on the floor of the unit, then stood for a moment in the doorway, understanding that she was surrendering something irreplaceable in exchange for something invaluable: the continued safety of people who had become more than colleagues, who had become the closest thing to family she'd had since losing her parents. As Elena drove away from the storage facility, her phone rang with a number she now recognized. "It's done," she said without preamble. "We know." "And Dr. Vasquez?" "Yes. Congratulations on your successful meeting with the State Medical Board. We understand your license has been suspended pending investigation." Elena's blood chilled. They'd been monitoring her more closely than she'd realized, tracking not just her movements, but her professional status, her legal vulnerabilities. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means that Elena Vasquez is no longer useful to us, which means our arrangement is complete." Elena felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "What arrangement?" "Doctor, did you really think we wanted those files for ourselves? We wanted them gone, destroyed, removed from the world permanently. You've just helped us eliminate the only remaining evidence that could threaten certain people's reputations and freedom." The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been manipulated into destroying evidence rather than preserving it, tricked into eliminating the very information she'd risked her life to collect and preserve. "The drive is encrypted," she said desperately. You'll never be able to access the information. Doctor, we have people who specialize in breaking encryption. Give us time and we'll crack any code you might have created. But more importantly, we now know that drive represents the only copy of those files. Once it's destroyed, the evidence disappears forever. Elena pulled over to the side of the road, understanding that she'd been outmaneuvered by people who had spent 3 years studying her psychology, learning her weaknesses, identifying exactly how to manipulate her into doing what they wanted. However, the voice continued, we're not entirely unreasonable. Your cooperation has been noted and appreciated. In recognition of your assistance, we're prepared to offer you a generous severance package. What kind of package? 24 hours to disappear, Doctor. Clean up your affairs, say your goodbyes, and vanish into whatever new identity you can create. After that, we can't guarantee your safety or the safety of people you might have involved in your situation. Elena closed her eyes, understanding that she'd traded temporary safety for permanent exile, bought a few hours of grace at the cost of justice for the victims whose names were stored on that drive. And if I refuse, then Elena Vasquez becomes a person of interest in a federal investigation into medical license fraud, and Dr. Amira Kassim becomes the subject of an international manhunt. Either way, your life in America ends. The only question is whether it ends quietly or dramatically. The line went dead, leaving Elena alone on the side of a road that led away from the only home she'd known in 3 years, toward an uncertain future in which she'd once again be a woman without a past, a doctor without credentials, a survivor without sanctuary. She thought about the backup packages she'd mailed, understanding now that they represented not insurance, but futility. Without the original encrypted drive to verify their authenticity, the copies would be dismissed as fabrications, the evidence they contained worthless without proper chain of custody, and technical verification. Elena had been comprehensively outmaneuvered, her own careful nature and protective instincts turned against her by people who understood exactly how to exploit both her strengths and her weaknesses. But as she sat in her car, watching traffic flow past her toward destinations that suddenly seemed impossibly distant and unattainable, Elena realized that she'd learned something important about herself in the process of losing everything she'd built. She was still a doctor. She was still someone who chose to protect the innocent, even at enormous personal cost. She was still a person who would sacrifice her own safety for the welfare of others. Those things couldn't be taken from her by blackmail or threats or bureaucratic investigations. They were who she was, regardless of what name she used or what documents defined her legal existence. Elena started her car and drove back toward the hospital, understanding that she had 24 hours to say goodbye to a life that had become more precious to her than she'd realized, and to prepare for another reinvention that might or might not allow her to continue being the person she'd remembered how to be. 6 months after the revelation that had transformed her understanding of safety and protection, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood before a packed auditorium at the International Conference on Trauma Recovery, delivering a presentation that would reshape how medical professionals approached patients who had survived systematic abuse. The lecture hall at the Metropolitan Convention Center held 300 attendees: doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and researchers from around the world, all focused on the woman whose story had become legend in professional circles, though most of the details remained classified. Elena's hands, no longer hidden by gloves except when medical protocols required them, moved expressively as she spoke, her scars visible and unapologetic, transformed from sources of shame into teaching tools. The PowerPoint presentation behind her showed clinical data, treatment protocols, and outcome measurements, but her words carried the weight of lived experience translated into professional knowledge. When we treat patients who have survived torture, systematic abuse, or prolonged captivity, Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system, We must understand that their bodies remember trauma in ways that transcend conscious memory. Traditional treatment approaches often fail because they address symptoms without acknowledging the fundamental way that survival changes both physiology and psychology. In the audience, Sarah Chun sat in the front row, taking notes even though she'd helped develop much of the research Elena was presenting. Beside her, Dr. Richards smiled with the pride of a mentor watching his student transform personal suffering into professional contribution. Captain Torres occupied a seat near the back, his presence a reminder of the security considerations that still shaped Elena's public appearances, though the nature of the protection had evolved from defensive to celebratory. Elena clicked to her next slide, showing brain scans that illustrated neurological changes in torture survivors. What we've discovered through our longitudinal study of recovery patterns is that healing requires not just addressing psychological trauma, but rebuilding the neurological pathways that allow patients to trust their own bodily sensations, to interpret environmental cues accurately, and to form healthy attachments to other people. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.